Ever since the death of George Floyd in the United States, there's been somewhat of a war that's erupted, as we've seen, between Donald Trump as well as Twitter. Now, Twitter decided that they would essentially censor the President of the United States, hiding some of his content and saying that they were concerned that it could incite racism or fear, and that's why or violence, I think was the term, and that's why they decided to do it. Then everyone at Facebook looked towards Mark Zuckerberg as employees asked, well, what are you doing? And they went to Twitter and they took on Facebook, their own employer, some employees actually quitting Facebook over this as well. Dr. Karen Sutherland joins us now from the University of the Sunshine Coast to talk about social media for business. How are you doing?
Very well, how are you?
And good to talk to you later on in the morning for the first time.
I know. I'm a bit sort of more alert at the moment.
We're all more awake. So this is an interesting one where the president now is essentially being censored. We haven't seen this sort of thing before. What are your thoughts on it all and the handling of Twitter compared to Facebook?
Well, look, there's a fine line between fact-checking and censorship. And so I think Twitter saying that they were fact-checking, but the president was very unhappy with that because Twitter promotes itself as a neutral platform. So Trump was saying, well, you can't have it both ways. You either let free speech reign on there, and he also hinted that maybe the fact checkers are biased. And so what he's done is signed an executive order to try and, I guess, lift some current protections that the platforms have. So in the States, Facebook and Twitter, they're seen more as a platform rather than a broadcaster or a publisher. And so because of that, they're not held to the same account as, say, the broadcasting and media outlets are. And so you're trying to lift that so then the platforms will be held to account in relation to the material that's being allowed on their platforms. But it's quite ironic because that might mean that the platforms will clearly not Facebook, but the platforms will then come back and really fact check. And if that's the case, I don't know if Trump is fair.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because Donald Trump's been using Twitter for quite some time. You could sneakily say that Donald Trump saved Twitter in many respects, given that its platform was kind of falling over, user numbers were down. I think only 2% of Australians use Twitter. It certainly punches well above its weight as to what the mainstream actually utilise it for compared to Facebook and even Instagram, etc. But interestingly, when Donald Trump found himself in controversy many moons ago, of course, on Twitter, the platform said, well, he is the president of the United States. What he says is important regardless of what he says. It's interesting how that's now changed from this is the president, we will do what he said, we will report what he says, because even if he is inciting violence, which is what they've come across now, it's important that that becomes the story, that the president of the United States is doing that. So I'm wondering what actually changed inside Twitter HQ to say what the president says is different to us determining whether it's safe for people to hear what he says.
Yeah, look, and I don't know, and I think the actual thing was something, it was around sort of violence, but it's also something around the ballot and voting and things like that. And they fact-checked it and came back and said, no, that's incorrect. And so I mean, why are they doing it now? Why all of a sudden is it happening now? And is it happening? And it seemed to happen just before or at the very beginning of the the chaos and the protests and things that are happening right now. It's really interesting to see. I wonder why. And I mean, Facebook's response as well is really not surprising that they say no, we're going to do that.
And so talk to us about, the Facebook aspect of this too, because a lot of employees looking to Mark Zuckerberg, we know that Facebook's had a pretty interesting relationship or involvement, you might say, with the presidential election campaign and Russian hackers, etc. And they've been doing so much work apparently behind the scenes trying to make sure that whatever happened cannot happen again, but also not admitting that anything has happened. We've found ourselves in a funny situation. What can a leader learn from this, where essentially Facebook's competitor Twitter has taken a stance, employees are looking towards the company during such a civil unrest time for the United States, where you've literally got riots on the street and a rush to support protesters, a rush to support George Floyd, a rush to point the finger at what's been going wrong in American society for such a long time with this issue of race. They're looking towards Mark Zuckerberg, and he's apparently done a review and come out today and said we did nothing wrong.
Yeah, and I mean he's been consistent in this messaging all the time that he's always said he's not going to check political ads or political content. So he said that from the beginning. And I mean, I wonder just how much money he actually makes from political ads. I know there's rules around them now on Facebook when you're placing ads. You know, I mean, that would be, particularly around election time, that would be a big source of money for his platform. So yeah, it's interesting, but it's funny how he decides when or not he's going to fact check, because around COVID-19, remember, he was putting places where to get correct information, and you can report misinformation, and so it's like he sort of chooses for one thing and not the other. And so maybe he's seeing something that sees, like, say, COVID as something that can actually be quite dangerous for the community, but I guess political content not so. I don't know how he came up with that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that that's an interesting point about the political content, because there are politicians who say terrible things, and the trouble is if it's reported, it can incite people to follow what they say. But if it's not reported, it doesn't alert people to the sorts of things these people are saying. It's such a tricky one. Does art imitate life, or the other way around? Do politicians say bold things because they want to, you know, be elected, or to be seen to be loud and aggressive? Is that the sort of people that it gets? Has our media created politicians, or has our media changed because of politicians? What are your views?
Yeah, I think they feed off each other, you know,
Yeah.
I really do. And I think a lot of politicians will try and gauge what's going on via social media. But in saying that, there's been research, I mean, with our own elections, there have been researchers, I think it's at the University of Sydney, where they predicted the outcome of the election based on the sentiment. They were measuring sentiment on Facebook, and it was clear which way it was going to go. So, I mean, maybe if politicians took a bit more notice of the sentiment on there, they might have a better idea of how to craft their messages. But
Yeah.
again, there are different parts of our community who follow quite extreme ideals either side, and so having someone stand up with those ideals can be quite attractive for different parts of the community, particularly online, and makes it very easy to take and follow those, and also have that little bubble of information where you're just constantly seeing people with the same opinions as you.
Yeah, and at the same time, if you were to ban these people, I mean, a lot of politicians have bigger followings than you could possibly ever imagine. There are millions of people who follow Donald Trump to hear what he has to say, whether they like it or not. And I guess platforms would also be quite scared that he's too big to fail in that sense. If he walks out on Twitter and goes across to Facebook, then a lot of journos will, I guess, go with him, and that's where the conversation will go too. So it's a pretty tricky one. Dr. Karen Sutherland, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.